$5K a day giveaway.
Are you ready?
Yeah.
Yes!
This is the Ross Kaminsky Show.
You're a great American.
Now, Ross Kaminsky.
Come on, man.
On Denver's talk station, 630 KHOW.
Well, good morning. Happy Monday. I'm Ross. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for starting your day and your week with me. Shannon, did you just say that this is National Escargot Day?
I did.
Wow. Crazy. All right. As long as, see, this happens a lot. And I mention it from time to time, and you probably don't believe me. I'm not. And that is, just before the show starts, Shannon will say something to me that completely changes what I planned on talking about. And why not? It's not like I had important stuff to talk about anyway. So we might as well talk about snails on your plate. I have two snail stories for you, as long as you're going to bring up National Escargot Day. So first of all, Shannon, when I was 5, I think, around 5, my parents took me to a fancy restaurant. I forget, it's like a French name like Pierre's or something. I don't remember the name. But a fancy French restaurant in New Orleans. And, we're talking about now, somewhere around 1970, 1971. And I guess you had to, wear a sport coat and maybe a tie to go to this restaurant. Is that kind of place. And the way my parents tell the story, they say, when we walked into this restaurant and people are, they're spending big money for this meal in one of the finest restaurants in New Orleans. And they said you could almost hear the air just get sucked out of the restaurant when they walked in with a 5-year-old. because all these people spending all this money for a tremendous meal did not want a, whiny, loud 5-year-old, meaning me, interrupting their lovely and expensive meal. And so again, this is just the way my parents tell the story. I don't have any recollection of it myself. But I guess the waiter came over and started asking us what we wanted to order. And I said that I'd like to have some escargot. And my parents say, you could hear everyone around us who could hear me order just take a deep breath like, oh, it's going to be okay. This kid knows what he's doing. So even though I have no memory of it myself, that's my very first escargot story. Shannon, do you have an escargot story?
Producer Shannon.
My only, I have a couple growing up in a restaurant, but one of my favorite jokes is I had a pet snail for a while.
Oh.
I thought I could help him move faster by taking off his shell, but it only made him more sluggish.
All right. Should have known that was coming. Do you have it like a story of feeding escargot to Elvis Presley or something?
No, but working in the restaurant, I did have a coworker ask if I'd ever had it. I think I said no at the time. I was a teenager, and they said, well, here you go. And I said, well, shouldn't we cook it first? No, it's fine right out of the can. And so I ate raw escargot, not realizing it should be cooked.
Ew.
It's like a dirty eraser.
Oh, my goodness. That's interesting. One of the things that I learned later in life is that when you get escargot in a restaurant or you make it at home or whatever, like producer Shannon said, typically the snails will come in a can and they're not in shells, right? The shells are separate. And if you got a restaurant and you're making escargot, what you're doing is you buy these shells that I think they're real snail shells. I don't think they're fabricated out of something else. And then you buy the escargot in a can and you stuff them into the shells, and then the people pull the escargot out of the shells with the little fork or whatever, and then you reuse the shells. And I guess it makes sense because I bet, now I wouldn't bet my life on this, but I would bet that if you got a real snail and tried to do what Shannon did to his pet snail that made it a little more sluggish. I'm guessing that the snail has some kind of physical connection to the shell, and you couldn't just easily pull it out with a little fork. Like you ever go eat a clam, right? And it's got that little like tendon sort of thing that you got to rip off, you know. Gosh, what a weird subject to start a week with, Shannon. Thank you very much for that. But as long as, you know, you're dragging me down that road, I do have another snail story for you. So, I was in China with my friend Mike. Yeah, with my friend Mike. And I think we were in the city of Suzhou, which by American standards is enormous. By Chinese standards, I think it's medium-sized. Let me see if I can look up the population real quick. 10.72 million. Yeah, so that's a medium to medium-small city. Although I have a feeling it was actually quite a bit smaller. It did not feel anything like an enormous city when we were there. I remember we were walking down the road in Suzhou, and this gorgeous Chinese girl walked past us. Long black hair, just beautiful. And we said, ni hao, which means, like, hi there, hello. And she said ni hao back. And that was that. But that's not my snail story. That was just another thing that happened in Suzhou. That was probably the prettiest girl we saw on that trip. She was really, really beautiful. So anyway, so we go in this restaurant. And here, let me just do a little side thing here for a second. Chinese, Vietnamese also. I'm not sure which of the other East Asian languages, but I'm sure plenty of them are tonal languages rather than the American language, which is really just based on the consonants and vowels, but not the tones. In other words, if I said hot dog, and then let's say a French person or even a Chinese person came to the United States and said hot dog with a strange accent, you know, a Frenchman, hot dog. Or I don't know how a Chinese person would try to pronounce hot dog. I'm not going to attempt to do that accent because someone will call me racist when all it would be my failure to do an adequate Chinese accent. But my point is you would understand the word, right? If a Frenchman said, I would like a hot dog, you would understand that, right? You would say, do you want ketchup or mustard or relish on your hot dog, or would you like fries with that? Okay, but these tonal languages, I cannot believe we got into this conversation right off the bat on a Monday morning, Shannon. But it's probably more fun than whatever it was. Not that I really had anything planned today anyway. It's just like, we'll just get in there and see what happens and hope it comes out okay. But anyway, these tonal languages are really different. So imagine, let's just stick with Chinese. If you were going to take a Chinese word that you would transliterate, meaning write it in American letters, which doesn't mean translating the word into whatever it means. It just means writing it in other letters. And you were to take a Chinese word that you would transliterate as, let's say, Tang, and I don't mean like the orange drink that the astronauts drank, which is, do they still make Tang? Yeah, I haven't seen that in so long. As if I need another tangent, food-related tangent on the show this morning. Tangent. Nice. So, anyway, in Chinese, there might be a word that sounds like tang, but if you pronounce it with a slightly different accent on the vowel or on what part of it you emphasize, tang, like that. Did you hear how subtle those differences were that I just did there? Tang, 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 like that. As an American, you would write all of them as T-A-N-G, and you would understand all of them to mean the same thing. In Chinese, that would be three different words, and the words don't have to have anything at all to do with each other. I could be getting this wrong, but I believe, just as an example, that the word for the number 4 sounds to an American ear essentially identical, and you would write it with the same American letters if you were transliterating it, as the word for snake, right? But they don't have anything to do with each other naturally. It's just, so it's a tonal language. And that means, as an American, if you slightly mispronounce something, let's say you're supposed to say tang and you say tang, right? They won't understand you. It is not like hot dog and hot dog, right? You following me so far, Shannon? Okay, so because it's a tonal language. And if I remember correctly, Chinese has 4 tones and Vietnamese has 6 tones. And that means that as hard as you might try, unless you are saying one of the most common things ever, like ni hao, which means hello, or shei shei, which means thank you in Mandarin, right? Everybody knows those, and it's kind of hard to mispronounce them, even though I probably am actually mispronouncing them. Those words are so common, and so many foreigners probably say them that they're used to it. But you try to get a little beyond that, and they won't understand you, even though you would think they should based on the context. But it's because, like, if some, again, stick with hot dog versus hot dog. Imagine if in English, hot dog, which you and I understand as hot dog, but imagine if that instead meant, a giant semi-truck. And somebody said, I want a hot dog. And you're like, what? Like, we're here at the Wiener Circle on Clark Street in Chicago, and you're asking for a Mack truck? It would be like that, even though you would think you'd understand it because you're in a hot dog place and he's asking for a hot dog, which sounds a lot like it. Okay, so Mike and I go to this restaurant. The most common food in China is fried noodles. Hard to think of something other than maybe a hamburger that is as ubiquitous hamburger in America, that is ubiquitous like fried noodles in China, but I'd say it's even more in China, fried noodles. Now, if you were to go to a Chinese restaurant and you wanted fried noodles for the places that sell it, you'd order chow mein, right? Which means fried noodles, right? M-I-E-N is noodles, but it's not really pronounced mein in Chinese. And by the way, there are other Asian languages that use that kind of word for noodles. Indonesian uses mi, M-I, which is probably a derivative of that. But anyway, in Chinese, it's something like chow mein, which if you were transliterating it, you'd probably write C-H-O-W-M-I-E-N, and then Americans who have never heard the Chinese pronunciation would say chow mein. And then and then Chinese restaurant workers who work in America and are used to people butchering the language and trying to pronounce their stuff would say, okay, chow mein means chow mein. But since it's so common, Mike and I went in this restaurant, and we've been in other restaurants too, but we were in other restaurants where they had English menus and waiters who spoke English, not very many, but usually there's one in a restaurant. But here there were none. And there were no English menus. So we heard all these people around us ordering fried noodles, and I love fried noodles, and so many people were ordering it that I was guessing this place must do an incredible fried noodles here. So we looked at the waiter, and we're like, chow mein. Thinking, all right. It's the most common thing, and everybody else is ordering it. Chow mein. And he looks at us. What? Huh? And we try with slightly different accents. Chow mein, chow mein, chow mein, chow mein. We try everything. And to me, the differences in how I'm pronouncing it are very, very small. But I'm just trying every small little adjustment I can to try to get that right tone. Even though, again, in context, in a restaurant where everyone around me is eating fried noodles and I'm trying to eat fried noodles, you'd think that he would get it. He gave me this quizzical look, acted like he understood, walked away, and came back some minutes later with a large plate, almost like a platter rather than a plate. And I'm trying to think of how to describe the size. It would be like if you were making a a medium-sized pizza, and it was kind of a flat tray about the diameter you would use for a medium-sized pizza. And it was covered with this almost pyramid-shaped steaming heap of snails. Like more snails than you've ever seen in one place. And I'm thinking, dude, how did we get from fried noodles to that? To that? And then I'm looking at these snails. Mike's looking at these snails, and we don't know whether to laugh or cry. We don't know whether to eat them or not. And they're probably delicious, but it's not what I wanted. I'm not afraid of eating snails, although I probably don't want 130 of them. And another waiter walks by. The table, going to a different table, a different waiter walks by, carrying a plate of fried noodles. And I look at my waiter, and I point to that, and I say, I want that. And he looks at me and says, "Oh, chaud bien." I'm like, oh my gosh, I thought I said that like 20 different times. And he took the snails away and eventually brought the fried noodles. And that was my very, very long-winded second snail story for you, which I think producer Shannon appreciates because he comes from a restaurant background. But yeah, thank you. Thank you. Can we be done with snails for a little while? Hey, if anybody has a snail story, email it to me at ross@khow.com or text it to me at 57739. If we get a good snail story or two, I'll share them on the air. That would be fun. But speaking of that lovely golf clap there that producer Shannon just awarded me with for my snail story, Phil Mickelson won the PGA Championship this weekend. 50 years old. 50 years old. Now, that makes him a couple of years younger than I am, but still it gives me some hope. The other thing is, first of all, huge congratulations. I mean, he hadn't done anything, big for years and years and years, and then he comes out and wins the PGA at just a brutal course and a brutal day with wind and blowing sand and all kinds of stuff, and he beat all the youngsters. The one thing that I do wonder about is, does this prove that golf isn't really a sport? If a 50-year-old can win it. We'll be right back.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KHOW, Denver.